The village lay nestled in the lap of the mountains, where the air was always thick with mist that crept down from the peaks like veils of wandering spirits. The people there believed the land itself breathed with them, that the forests listened, and that the river running silver through the valley carried not just water but memory, as though it whispered all the old songs of those who came before. The clans of this valley were proud, bound to traditions that were older than the stone shrines scattered at the edges of the fields. Every ritual mattered, every word of honor carried weight, and every betrayal left marks that could burn through generations. To be born into such a place was to inherit not just life but the burden of all who lived and died in the shadow of the mountains. Among these clans was a child named Eileen. She had been born on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms rained their petals across the riverbank, and the elders said that the sweetness of that day lived in her. She grew as though the sunlight itself loved her, with a quiet grace that drew people near. Her mother, now long gone, had been from a line of women known for their wisdom and compassion. That blood had carried into Eileen, and even as a girl she showed kindness far beyond her years. She was the child who would kneel to tie a stray goat's tether, who would give her food to a hungry boy without hesitation, who would soothe the sick with songs her mother once sang to her. The elders respected her, though she was but a child, because they said she carried the same light her mother had carried before death claimed her. Her father, a man both stern and weary from his duties, loved Eileen fiercely. Yet grief hollowed him after his wife's passing, and grief can make even the strongest man bend. 4 years he tried to raise Eileen alone, but loneliness is a dangerous companion, and whispers spread through the clan that a man could not hold a household without a woman's hand. It was in those years that another woman came to him. She was graceful, soft-spoken, and knew how to lower her eyes in respect when the elders passed. To the clan she seemed the answer to his sorrow, and to him she was a balm for his emptiness. And so, in the season when the fields turned golden, she entered his home as wife and stepmother. At first, Eileen tried to welcome her. She brought flowers to the woman's door, spoke gently, and hoped in her heart that this new mother might ease the ache she carried. But there was something in the stepmother's gaze that Eileen did not understand, something sharp behind the smiles. The woman's voice was honeyed when others were near, her hands tender when she served food, her laughter sweet when the clans gathered. Yet in the quiet corners of the house, her eyes hardened, and her words cut like thorns hidden beneath petals. No one else saw it, for she was clever in her performance, and even Eileen's father, blinded by the hope of peace, could not see past her charm. Still, the mountains and forests seemed to know. Strange omens began to stir, small at first but undeniable. On a night when the moon hung red and swollen, an elder spoke by the fire, his voice low and heavy with warning. He said that bloodlines carried secrets, that not all inheritances were gold or land, and that some legacies returned to claim the living when least expected. He looked at Eileen then, his gaze so piercing that her small hands trembled, though she did not understand why. Later, when she wandered near the river, a wandering seer with wild hair and eyes clouded by visions told her to beware of women who smile too sweetly, for sweetness can mask poison. He pressed into her palm a pebble shaped like an eye and whispered, "The truth sleeps in your blood, child, but it will not sleep forever." These words sank into Eileen's heart like roots, though she could not yet grasp their meaning. She only knew that the world she loved, the laughter of the fields, the warm voices of her kin, the safety of her father's arms, had begun to shift, as though a shadow crept slowly over the valley. She felt it in the way the stepmother's hand lingered too long on the father's arm, in the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, and in the heaviness that began to press on her dreams at night. The villagers still adored Eileen, still saw in her the echo of her mother's spirit. But within the walls of her own home, something was stirring. The stepmother's ambition was a quiet fire, hidden beneath silken gestures, and though no one else could see it, Eileen sensed its heat. In the misty village where honor and betrayal burned deeper than any wound of the flesh, the seeds of a tale were already being sown. And while Eileen still walked as a child of innocence, the mountains themselves seemed to lean closer, waiting for the moment when the buried secret would rise and burn them all. The seasons turned, and with them Eileen grew from a tender child into a slender girl on the cusp of womanhood, but the warmth of her days dimmed quickly beneath the cold shadow of her stepmother's reign. Within the walls of her father's home, once a place of laughter and stories, silence settled like frost. The stepmother, who had once hidden her sharpness beneath smiles, no longer felt the need to conceal it so carefully. She had children of her own now, a boy and a girl born in quick succession, and all the sweetness of her voice was reserved for them. For Eileen, there were only commands spoken with impatience, punishments for small mistakes, and the constant reminder that she was a burden whose place was fragile. Her father, wearied by the demands of the clan and softened by the joy of holding new children in his arms, did not see the cruelties. When the stepmother pressed his hand and told him that Eileen was difficult, he sighed and trusted her judgment. When she whispered that Eileen grew arrogant because the villagers still praised her beauty and kindness, he believed it might be so. Slowly, the bond between father and daughter thinned, not because he stopped loving her, but because he became blind to how she was being pushed aside. The stepmother's children thrived in the warmth of their mother's attention. Their plates were filled first, their clothes mended with care, their games played under the approving gaze of their mother. But when Eileen reached for bread at the table, her stepmother's hand would slap hers away, telling her to wait until the others were finished. If the pot ran empty, it was always Eileen who went hungry. When she asked for new shoes after hers wore thin from the long walks to the fields, she was told she was ungrateful and undeserving, that she should learn humility by going barefoot. The clan saw her in the fields, working tirelessly with a smile, and thought she lived a blessed life, never knowing how her nights were spent shivering on a straw mat while her stepmother's children slept beneath blankets. Rumors began to curl like smoke through the village, faint at first but growing stronger as the stepmother fed them carefully. She told neighbors that strange things happened when Eileen was near, that milk curdled in its jar or that dogs howled when she passed. She whispered that Eileen had inherited a curse from her mother's bloodline, that the girl was touched by something unnatural. Though many dismissed these whispers at first, remembering the kindness of her late mother, some began to watch Eileen with suspicion. Children who once played freely with her were called back by their parents, and friends she had known since infancy began to keep their distance. To live in a village so bound to honor and tradition was to live under the weight of words, and even a whisper could poison a reputation. Eileen bore the pain silently, because silence was all she had. She worked hard, rising before the sun to fetch water and staying awake long into the night to mend the household's clothes, while her stepmother claimed credit for the work before the father. Yet for all the hardships, there was a light within Eileen that could not be smothered. It came from her mother, whose memory was her only comfort. Tucked beneath her garments, close to her heart, she kept a small amulet her mother had left behind, a carved piece of riverstone shaped like a crescent moon. When the nights grew too heavy, she pressed it against her chest and remembered the songs her mother used to hum. The words were faint now in her memory, but the melody lived on, carrying her back to gentler times. There was one evening, when the stepmother's cruelty reached a point that left a scar not upon Eileen's skin but upon her soul. It was during the harvest festival, when every household brought offerings of grain, fruit, and meat to the clan's sacred fire. Eileen had saved a handful of apples, polished them until they gleamed like jewels, intending to offer them in her mother's memory. But as she walked toward the fire, her stepmother seized the apples from her hands and placed them into her own children's baskets, telling the crowd they had gathered them with diligence. The clan praised the children, smiling at their contribution, while Eileen stood empty-handed. Worse still, her stepmother turned to the elders and said with feigned sorrow that Eileen had come to the fire with nothing, as though she cared nothing for the clan's traditions. Murmurs spread, sharp as knives, and Eileen's cheeks burned with shame. That night she wept alone by the river, clutching the crescent amulet in her palm. The water shimmered with the reflection of the moon, and in its silver light she thought she heard her mother's voice carried on the current. "Endure, my child," it seemed to say. "The truth will not remain buried forever." Her tears fell into the river, and she whispered a vow to her mother's memory that she would not let the stepmother's lies extinguish the light that lived in her blood. So Eileen endured, though each passing year under her stepmother's cold rule carved deeper lines of loneliness into her heart. She grew not with the carefree joy of other children but with a strength forged in silence, a strength that the stepmother mistook for weakness. And though the clan's whispers stung her like nettles, she held fast to the lullabies, to the amulet, and to the fading warmth of her mother's spirit. For within her, something remained unbroken, waiting for the day when the truth would rise from the shadows and return to burn brighter than any lie. The years had hardened Eileen into a young woman, her beauty like a quiet flame that drew eyes even when she tried to remain unseen. But beauty was no shield against the storm that was gathering in her home. It began with her father, who had once been the strong pillar of their household, striding across the fields with broad shoulders and a voice that carried authority. Slowly, his strength drained as though something unseen gnawed at his very bones. At first, he complained of weariness, of a heaviness that clung to his limbs. Soon he struggled to rise from his bed, his skin pale, his voice frail. The healers brought herbs and prayers, but nothing touched the sickness that hollowed him. Rumors spread swiftly in the misty village. Some whispered that the mountain spirits had turned against him, others that it was the work of human hands. And though no one dared say it too loudly, eyes turned toward Eileen, for the seed of suspicion her stepmother had planted over the years had taken root. The stepmother fanned the whispers carefully, sighing in sorrow to neighbors that perhaps Eileen's cursed blood was to blame, that ever since she had come of age, shadows had grown thicker around the house. Her words were always clothed in grief and concern, but each one was sharpened to cut at Eileen's reputation. Eileen, desperate, tried to care for her father. She brought him water, cooled his fever, sang the old lullabies her mother once sang in hopes that his restless sleep would ease. He would take her hand weakly, his eyes clouded but still tender, yet even then the stepmother found ways to turn his trust. She would lean close and murmur, "See how she hovers, as though waiting for your last breath. She dreams of your inheritance, not your recovery." In his weakened state, doubt began to stir in him, and Eileen felt it, though he never spoke it aloud. When his sickness deepened, the clan council was summoned, for the family of a leader could not suffer in silence. The elders gathered in the hall, their robes heavy with the weight of tradition, their faces stern as they listened. The stepmother played her role masterfully, her eyes red from feigned weeping, her voice trembling as she declared that the misfortune upon her husband could not be mere chance. She spoke of strange sights, the milk spoiling, the dogs howling, her children falling ill and then recovering as soon as Eileen left their side. She wove the years of rumors into a tapestry of accusation, painting Eileen as a secret whose very presence poisoned the household. Eileen stood before them, trembling not from guilt but from rage and sorrow. She pleaded with the council, speaking of her devotion to her father, of her work in the fields, of her faithfulness to the clan's traditions. But the stepmother's words weighed heavily, and the elders, fearful of curses and dishonor, leaned toward the safety of suspicion. One elder asked sharply if Eileen carried charms, and when she pulled the crescent amulet from her neck, meaning to show them her mother's blessing, a murmur of dread swept through the hall. The stepmother seized the moment, crying out that the amulet was the source of her witchcraft, a dark token she had hidden for years. It was then that the council passed judgment. Before the gathered clan, they declared that Eileen was tainted, a danger to her kin. She would be stripped of her inheritance, denied her father's land and name, and cast into the wilderness until the spirits themselves decided her fate. The stepmother wept as though the judgment pained her, but behind her veil of tears, her eyes glittered with triumph. The humiliation was public and cruel. Eileen was led to the square, where villagers who had once smiled upon her now looked on in silence or fear. Some whispered pity, but none dared to defend her. Her amulet was torn from her neck and tossed into the dust, and her father, too weak to rise, could only watch from the shadows of his bed, his lips moving with words she could not hear. She searched his eyes for a sign, for some glimmer of the love that had once shielded her, but all she saw was a man broken by sickness and doubt. When they drove her from the gates, she walked barefoot, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back. The wilderness loomed before her, vast and unforgiving, the mountains rising like jagged teeth. Behind her, the clan returned to their fires and fields, as though she had never belonged. She did not cry where they could see her, she lifted her chin, her eyes burning brighter than her stepmother's false tears. But once the mist swallowed the village and she was alone, her body shook with sobs that tore from her chest. Yet even in her despair, something deeper stirred within her. Standing upon the cold earth, the night pressing close around her, Eileen pressed her hands together and swore silently. She swore to her mother's memory, to the river that had carried her tears as a child, to the mountains that had watched her grow. She swore that she would return, not as the broken girl they had cast out, but as something stronger, something that would make them tremble. She did not yet know what lay ahead in the wilderness, but she knew this: betrayal had cut her down, and from that cut, a fire had begun to burn. The wilderness did not welcome Eileen kindly. The first nights she spent beneath the open sky were cruel ones, with cold winds threading through her thin garments and hunger clawing at her belly. She stumbled through forests where the trees loomed like giants, their branches creaking as though whispering to one another in a language she could not understand. The river, once a friend, roared with indifference, forcing her to wade through its icy currents when she had no bridge. Her feet blistered on the sharp stones, her hands bled from tearing roots and scraping bark to find food, and her body thinned with the relentless trial of survival. Yet she did not die. Each dawn she rose, though her bones ached, and each dusk she found shelter, though it was little more than hollow logs or caves damp with moss. A will stronger than hunger or cold drove her onward, a fire inside that remembered her vow: she would return. It was during one of those desperate nights, when she had gone 3 days without proper food, that she stumbled upon a hut hidden in the depths of the forest. Smoke curled faintly from its roof, and a soft orange glow flickered through cracks in the wood. Cautiously, she approached, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But when the door creaked open, it revealed not a warrior or beast but an old hermit, his back bent with age, his hair white as snow, and his eyes sharp with a strange brightness. He looked at her as though he had been waiting. "Child of sorrow," he murmured, his voice rasping like dry leaves, "the forest has carried your cries." Eileen collapsed at his threshold, too weak to answer, and he carried her inside with surprising strength. There, she tasted hot broth for the first time in weeks, and the warmth spread through her body like sunlight. The hermit nursed her back to health, and when she regained her strength, he spoke to her of things she had never heard before. He told her that survival was not only a matter of flesh but of spirit, that the mountains themselves listened to those who knew how to speak with silence. He taught her how to move without disturbing the forest, how to read omens in the patterns of falling leaves, how to still her breath until even the birds forgot she was there. "Strength," he said, "is not in the arm that strikes, but in the heart that endures without breaking." From him, she learned patience and the quiet power of observation. Yet her journey did not end with the hermit. After many months in his company, she felt the pull to move onward, as though something in her blood called her to roads yet untrodden. She thanked him, and he gave her a parting gift, a staff carved with spirals that seemed to shift like water when she turned it in her hands. "This will remind you that even the crooked path has meaning," he said. Her wanderings carried her beyond the forest, into valleys where strangers spoke in dialects unfamiliar to her and markets overflowed with colors and scents she had never imagined. It was there she met a wandering healer, a woman with hair braided in silver threads and hands that smelled always of herbs. The healer took Eileen under her wing, sensing the hunger in her not just for food but for knowledge. She taught her the arts of plants, the leaves that could heal a fever, the roots that could draw poison from blood, the blossoms that could ease pain or bring sleep. But there was more. The healer spoke of energies unseen, of the rhythm of breath aligned with the earth's pulse, of dreams that could reveal truths hidden in waking hours. Eileen listened, practiced, and learned. She discovered her hands held a gift, that when she touched wounds, warmth spread from her palms into the skin of others. The healer smiled knowingly but offered no answers, only telling her, "You carry the echo of those who came before. In your veins runs more than blood, it is memory." Years passed like seasons shifting, and Eileen grew not only in skill but in presence. Her once frail frame grew strong from travel, her eyes keen from watching, her voice steady from chanting old songs taught by healers and hermits alike. She learned to carry herself like one who belonged anywhere, whether in the hut of a hermit or the halls of merchants who respected her craft. And along her path, whispers reached her ears, whispers of a society hidden among mountains far from her village, a brotherhood and sisterhood who guarded knowledge too dangerous for common hands. Drawn by instinct, she sought them and, after trials that tested her endurance and her honesty, they accepted her into their circle. There she encountered scrolls older than the stones of her homeland, teachings of spirits bound to rivers, and tales of bloodlines chosen to safeguard sacred truths. Among the scrolls, she found words that pierced her heart, a prophecy of women born under the crescent moon, destined to carry both suffering and power. The symbol was carved in the same shape as the amulet her mother had left her. It was then that the pieces began to fit. Her mother had not been merely a kind woman beloved by the clan. She had been part of a lineage entrusted with ancient knowledge, a legacy of healing and power that threatened those who hungered for control. Eileen realized that her stepmother's hatred had not been born only of jealousy but of fear of what she carried unknowingly in her blood. This discovery did not fill her with bitterness alone. It gave her purpose. She was no longer merely the exiled daughter, no longer the outcast scraping for survival. She was heir to a truth that could not be buried, student of wisdom no stepmother could poison, bearer of a legacy that reached back through generations. She was becoming something her clan had tried to erase, a woman stronger than the lies told against her. By the time she left the society, years older and transformed, the girl Eileen was gone. In her place walked a woman with eyes like tempered steel, with hands that could heal or wound, with knowledge that shimmered beneath her skin like hidden fire. The wilderness had stripped her, broken her, and built her anew. And though her path had been carved by betrayal, it now pointed toward destiny. She was ready, though she did not yet know how, to return to the misty village that had cast her out. And when she did, she would not return empty. She would return with a secret that would burn them all. The years had spun onward like the slow wheel of the seasons, carrying Eileen far from the girl she once had been. When she finally turned her steps back toward the misty valley of her birth, she did not look like the frail outcast who had been cast into the wilderness barefoot and weeping. Her body was strong, her gaze steady, her bearing proud, and the clothes she wore were those of a traveler seasoned by many lands, sturdy, weather-stained, and cloaked in shadows of experience. She carried a staff with carvings that gleamed faintly in the light, and at her side hung a satchel filled with herbs and scrolls whose secrets no villager could guess. Even her face, though still bearing the delicate beauty inherited from her mother, had sharpened into something the years of hardship had chiseled. A mask of wisdom, a visage that no one would immediately tie to the girl they had banished. The valley was not as she remembered. Once, the fields had rippled with golden grain, the air had carried the music of children's laughter, and the clan had walked with pride in their traditions. Now the crops were sparse, the soil cracked in places where rain had grown reluctant, and the people looked weary, their backs bent not just from labor but from despair. Rumors reached her ears quickly as she passed through the markets, cloaked and unnamed. There had been years of famine, of sickness that swept through children and elders alike. The rivers had swelled and flooded one season, only to dry and shrink the next. And always, through it all, one voice had grown louder, that of her stepmother, who now sat in a seat of influence among the council, her words guiding decisions, her hands holding wealth. It did not surprise Eileen to hear it. The woman had always been skilled at weaving lies into garlands, at twisting sorrow into a ladder for her own rise. But to see how deeply she had sunk her claws into the clan pained Eileen in ways she did not expect. Families turned against one another over scraps of food, neighbors hoarded grain rather than sharing, and suspicion gnawed at the unity that once defined the village. Honor, once the lifeblood of the clans, had withered into something thin and brittle. 4 days, Eileen kept her name hidden. She walked the streets like a stranger, trading herbs for bread, offering remedies for fevers, listening to the voices of villagers who spoke freely to her because they did not recognize her. In their words, she gathered proof. She learned of the stepmother's schemes, how she had claimed portions of land under the pretense of managing them for the sick father, how she had arranged marriages for her children that brought her more wealth and influence, how she had silenced anyone who questioned her with threats of curses. To many, she appeared a woman of strength, a savior even, but beneath the surface lay resentment and fear. People grumbled when they thought no one listened, and more than one pair of eyes held shadows of doubt. And yet, among the weary villagers, there were moments that made Eileen's heart stir. Once, when she bent to help an old man gather his spilled basket of grain, he froze, staring into her eyes. His lips trembled, and he whispered her mother's name, though his voice was too faint for others to hear. He shook his head quickly, as though doubting his own vision, and said no more. Another time, an elder woman pressed a coin into Eileen's hand after she treated her cough. The woman's eyes lingered on her face, wet with unspoken memory, before she turned away. They recognized something, perhaps the curve of her smile, the tilt of her gaze, that belonged to the woman they had loved and lost long ago. But none dared speak it aloud. The fear of the stepmother's wrath, and the weight of the clan's shame, sealed their lips. Eileen did not reveal herself yet. She knew the danger of rushing into the open. The stepmother's power was too great, her grip on the clan too firm. To show her face too soon would only invite her downfall once more. So she moved like the mist, slipping unseen through corners of the village, gathering fragments of truth. She listened at the marketplace, she lingered near the council hall, and she followed whispers that led her to records hidden in elders' houses, scrolls that bore her father's name and the inheritance that had been denied her. Piece by piece, the story of her betrayal became whole, not just in her memory but in evidence she could place before others when the time was right. Still, the suspense gnawed at her. Each time she walked past her old home, her heart throbbed in her chest. She saw her stepmother there, standing tall, her hair streaked with silver but her face still proud, her laughter ringing false as ever. She saw her half-siblings too, grown now, adorned in fine clothes, their eyes cold with the arrogance of privilege. They did not know the stranger watching them from the shadows was the sister they had cast out. Eileen pressed her hand to the amulet she had reclaimed during her years of exile, the crescent moon symbol that had once condemned her. Now she wore it openly beneath her cloak, no longer ashamed, no longer afraid. It reminded her that her time was coming. The clan believed her gone forever, perhaps dead, perhaps forgotten, but she was here, stronger, wiser, and armed with the knowledge of her lineage. The village lived in uneasy silence, divided by greed and hunger, ruled by a woman whose throne of lies teetered though none dared topple it. But Eileen walked among them like a shadow of fate, patient as the mountain that loomed above the valley, waiting for the storm. She gathered her proof, she watched, and she prepared. The day of reckoning was drawing near, and when it came, no mask of false kindness, no chain of lies, would shield her stepmother from the truth Eileen carried home like fire hidden in her heart. The festival of renewal came as it always did, though the people had little left to celebrate. In earlier years, it had been a time of abundance, when families brought baskets heavy with fruit, grain, and roasted meats to lay at the sacred fire in honor of the ancestors. This year the baskets were thin, some nearly empty, but tradition demanded that the fire be lit, the songs sung, and the council gather in solemn procession. The mist clung low to the valley, as if the mountains themselves leaned down to witness what would unfold. Eileen had watched and waited for this day. She had gathered her proof in silence, spoken with those who still remembered her mother's name with reverence, and prepared the truth that burned inside her. She had walked long among the people, offering her healing hands in secret, earning their trust without revealing who she was. Now the time had come to step from the shadows. The clan assembled in the great square, a circle of stones that had seen countless generations stand in judgment, celebration, and mourning. At the center blazed the sacred fire, its flames leaping hungrily, devouring the meager offerings placed before it. Elders stood in their robes, their staffs planted firmly in the ground. The stepmother was there as well, draped in fine cloth, her silver-streaked hair woven into braids that proclaimed her status. Her children, now grown and proud, flanked her like attendants to a queen. She moved among the people with the ease of power, her smiles wide, her words commanding, as though the hardships of the clan were hers alone to bear. The ceremony began with prayers, the elders chanting in low voices, asking the ancestors to bless the fields, to lift the famine, to restore the strength of the people. But the air was heavy with doubt, for many had prayed the same in years past and seen no answer. Murmurs of discontent rippled beneath the chants, and the people shifted uneasily, eyes cast toward the fire as if expecting nothing. It was then that Eileen stepped forward. Cloaked in a traveler's garb, her hood shadowing her face, she entered the circle of firelight. At first, few paid her mind, strangers sometimes wandered in during festivals, and many thought her another wanderer seeking blessing. But when she raised her staff and struck it against the stone, the sound rang clear and sharp, silencing the crowd. "I bring a truth long buried," she said, her voice carrying with a strength that startled even herself. "And tonight, before the ancestors, it will be spoken." The elders frowned, uncertain, but the stepmother narrowed her eyes. Something in the voice tugged at her memory, and unease flickered across her face. Eileen drew back her hood, and gasps rose like wind through the crowd. The villagers stared, stunned, at the woman before them. Though years and hardship had changed her, though her face had sharpened and her eyes glowed with a power they had never seen, there was no mistaking the likeness to the woman they had once loved, the same curve of the cheek, the same fire in the gaze. Whispers flew like sparks. "It is her, it cannot be. Eileen?" The stepmother staggered a step back, her mouth opening as if to deny what her eyes told her. "She is dead," she said, voice trembling. "We cast her out. She cannot stand here." But Eileen lifted her amulet, the crescent moon gleaming in the firelight. "You tore this from me," she said, her voice steady as stone. "You called it a curse. But this is the mark of my mother's bloodline, the legacy of guardians who have kept this valley alive for centuries. And because you severed me from it, the land has suffered." The crowd stirred, their eyes darting between Eileen and the stepmother. The famine, the sickness, the restless spirits, it all suddenly seemed heavier with meaning. An elder stepped forward, his face pale. "The prophecy," he whispered. "A child born beneath the crescent moon, bearer of the sacred blood. We thought it lost." Eileen's voice grew stronger, carrying over the murmurs. "You have been led by lies. My father did not weaken by fate alone. Poison was laid in his food and drink, poison that stole his strength while false words were placed in his ears. And when he could no longer protect me, I was cast out. All the while, you followed the one who whispered against me, the one who feasted while you starved." She pointed her staff at her stepmother, and the fire flared as though in answer. "It was her hand that sowed your ruin. She claimed power by deceit, and the ancestors have watched in silence until this night." The stepmother's face twisted, first in fear, then in rage. "Lies?" she cried, her voice shrill. "This is a trick, a curse meant to destroy us further. Do not listen to her." But Eileen did not falter. From her satchel she drew a scroll, brittle with age, given to her by the secret society she had joined. She held it aloft for all to see. "Here is the record of my mother's clan, guardians sworn to heal this land. Their blood carries knowledge of the earth and the power to bind curses and blessings alike. That blood runs in me, and no one else. You cast out your only shield, and you wonder why the valley suffers." From the edge of the crowd, an old voice rose. It was the hermit she had once known, now gaunt but still alive, who had traveled to stand at her side. Leaning on his staff, he called out, "I watched her rise from exile. I saw the fire of truth in her, and I tell you, this woman carries no curse but the strength to save you." His words carried weight, for though many feared him as a recluse of the forest, none doubted his wisdom. The people wavered, torn between fear of the stepmother and awe of Eileen. Mothers clutched their children, men shifted uneasily, elders whispered among themselves. The fire roared higher, as though demanding a choice. Eileen lowered her staff and let the silence hang. Then she spoke, softer but sharper than a blade. Tonight, you must decide. Will you cling to the lies that have bound you in famine and sorrow, or will you honor the truth of the bloodline meant to guard you? I am Eileen, daughter of this clan, rightful heir to my mother's legacy. I do not come to beg for place. I come to reveal what you have denied. And if you choose to turn away again, then your suffering is yours to keep. Her words struck like thunder, and the crowd erupted, not with certainty, but with the chaos of awakening. The stepmother shrieked denials, her children rushing to shield her, while the elders pressed together, their faces pale as the truth unraveled before them. And at the center, Eileen stood unmoving, her amulet gleaming, her presence unshaken. For whether they accepted her or not, the secret was no longer buried. It burned in the open air, and no storm could extinguish it. The night of revelation did not end with silence. Once the truth had been spoken, it was as if a dam had broken, and all that the stepmother had hidden began to flood outward. Whispers became accusations, accusations became shouts, and soon the square that had gathered to honor the ancestors turned into a place of reckoning. The sacred fire crackled high, casting fierce shadows across faces twisted with fear and rage. The stepmother tried to rally them, her voice shrill, her hands raised as though to calm the tide. "Do not be deceived," she cried. "This girl is a ghost come to curse us further. Have I not led you through famine? Have I not kept this clan from collapse?" But her words rang hollow now. For every boast she uttered, someone in the crowd shouted back a wound she had caused. The grain she had hoarded while children starved, the land she had stolen under false pretenses, the cruel whispers she had spread. It was as though the people had been waiting years for the chance to release their bitterness, and now the flood could not be stopped. Eileen did not move at first. She stood steady, her amulet gleaming in the firelight, watching the lies unravel. Her stepmother's face contorted, no longer the mask of elegance and authority but the raw, desperate visage of a woman cornered by truth. Her children clung to her, demanding the people listen, but their cries were drowned by the roar of voices. And then something happened that none could have foreseen. The fire at the center of the square leapt higher still, as if the ancestors themselves were furious. Sparks spiraled into the night, carried by the wind, and in moments, the thatched roofs of the nearest homes caught flame. Gasps and screams filled the air as fire spread hungrily, licking across wood and straw, a storm of light and smoke. Some cried it was an accident, others whispered it was the curse Eileen had spoken of, now released upon them. Whatever its cause, the village was burning. Panic surged. Families scrambled to save what little they had, buckets of water passed hand to hand, children lifted onto shoulders as flames roared around them. Amidst the chaos, the stepmother fell to her knees, clutching her head, shrieking that the girl had summoned the fire, that she was the end of them all. But others saw it differently. They saw the stepmother's lies as the true spark, the years of corruption that had dried the clan's heart to tinder. This fire, whether of nature or spirit, was the cleansing they had brought upon themselves. Eileen raised her staff, shouting above the din, "This is not my curse, it is your truth. The ancestors burn away the rot that has poisoned this clan. If you would live, you must choose, cling to the lies, or rise from the ashes with me." Her voice carried, sharp as the crack of thunder, and for a moment the people hesitated, torn between despair and hope. The stepmother, trembling, tried one last act of defiance. She lunged toward Eileen, clawing at her with wild eyes, shrieking words no longer coherent but dripping with venom. But the fire surged at that very moment, a wall of flame separating her from her prey. The people screamed, some calling for water, others too stunned to move, as the stepmother's figure vanished into smoke and heat. Whether she perished in the blaze or fled into the night, no one could say. Madness or death had claimed her, and she was gone. The fire raged until dawn, leaving the square blackened, homes collapsed, and much of the village scarred. Ash floated in the air like snow, settling on the weeping faces of the survivors. When the flames at last died, the people gathered around Eileen, their eyes hollow, their hearts heavy with guilt. One by one, voices broke the silence. "We wronged you," an elder whispered, his staff trembling in his hand. "We believed her lies." "We cast you into the cold," another said, tears cutting lines through soot on her face. "And still you return to us." "Forgive us, Eileen," they pleaded, falling to their knees before her. "Save us from what we have become." Eileen looked upon them, her chest tight with the weight of choice. She could see the faces of those who had mocked her, who had spat her name like venom, who had turned away when she had cried for mercy. She could leave them now, let the ashes bury their sins, walk away with the strength she had gained in exile. It would be justice, perhaps. It would be easy. But as she gazed upon them, she also saw the faces of children who had never lifted a hand against her, the tired eyes of mothers who had lost more than they could bear, the bent shoulders of elders who had simply been too afraid. They were broken, yes, but not beyond mending. And her mother's voice seemed to whisper in the depths of her heart, urging her not to let bitterness be the only inheritance she carried. Slowly, Eileen lifted her staff. The people gasped, fearing judgment, but instead she drove the staff into the earth. A tremor rippled outward, and where it struck, the blackened ground began to stir. Tiny shoots of green pushed through the ash, fragile but alive, a promise that the land could heal. "I will not turn from you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But neither will I carry your sins. The fire has burned what must be burned. If you would rise, you must do so with truth in your hearts. I will guide you, as my mother once did, but the choice to live in honor belongs to you." The people wept, some bowing low, others clutching the new shoots as if they were jewels. Eileen stood among them, weary but unbroken, knowing the clan had been forever changed. The burning had consumed not only homes but illusions, and what remained was raw, fragile, and ready to be rebuilt, or to wither, if they chose poorly once more. The stepmother was gone, the lies reduced to ash, but the scar of betrayal would linger. Yet Eileen, in choosing mercy over vengeance, had lit a different fire, the fire of renewal. And in the hearts of the people, for the first time in many years, a spark of hope flickered. The dawn after the burning came cold and grey, the smoke of smoldering ruins still coiling into the sky like black serpents. The village that had once bustled with pride now lay hushed, its heart scarred and broken. Ash covered the ground, coating faces and clothes, softening everything into a single color of sorrow. Yet, beneath the silence, life stirred. Eileen's staff had awakened the earth, and in places where fire had raged the fiercest, the first fragile shoots of green had begun to emerge. The clan gathered in the ruins of the square, faces hollow, eyes searching. They looked to Eileen now, no longer as the cursed child they had cast into the wilderness, but as the woman who had returned with both judgment and mercy. Whispers rose, "She is the daughter of the crescent moon, the blood of the guardians." Some begged her openly to take her place as leader, to restore what had been lost, to rebuild their homes and their honor. Others, too ashamed to lift their gaze, knelt silently in the ash, awaiting her decision. Eileen stood among them, the amulet of her mother's line glimmering faintly in the pale light. She thought of all she had endured, the hunger, the exile, the loneliness, the years of wandering in lands where no one knew her name. She thought of the hermit's lessons, of the healer's kindness, of the secret society who had revealed her mother's legacy. And she thought of the girl she had been, cast out by the very voices now begging her to save them. Her heart ached with the weight of choice. She could stay. She could take her rightful place, guide the clan with the wisdom she had earned, and ensure no one again suffered under lies and cruelty. Yet she also knew that leadership was a burden that chained one's spirit, and her years of freedom had carved something new within her. She had become more than this valley, more than this clan. She had seen the world beyond, felt the wild wind on mountains far from home, listened to stories told in tongues she had never known as a child. To remain would mean to close herself within these borders once more. She turned to the people, her voice steady though sorrow threaded through it. "This land is yours to heal. The fire has burned away what was false, but the work of rebuilding belongs to your hands. You cast me into the wilderness, and in that wilderness I found my strength. I will not carry your guilt, nor will I bind myself to chains of power. My path lies beyond these mountains." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some cried out in protest, others bowed their heads in acceptance. An elder, trembling, asked, "Will you not at least bless us, that the ancestors may know we walk with truth again?" Eileen lifted her staff one final time and drove it gently into the earth. From the point where it touched, a ring of green spread outward, pushing through ash and soot, a living circle that wrapped the square in hope. "This is my blessing," she said softly. "Honor it with deeds, not just words. Let truth be your guide, and you will rise again." She left them then, walking away from the square, past the charred remains of homes, past the river whose waters still carried the smell of smoke. The people watched her go in silence, some weeping, some whispering, all knowing they were witnessing the end of something greater than a festival or a fire. They were watching the departure of a legend in the making. Eileen did not look back. The mountains loomed before her, shrouded in mist as they had been on the day she was born. She walked with the certainty of one who belonged not to a single clan but to the stories that outlived them all. In time, her footsteps would fade, her face would blur in memory, but the fire of her truth would remain. Years passed, and the valley did rebuild. The stepmother's name was never spoken again except as a curse, and her children scattered, their arrogance burned to nothing. The clan struggled, yet slowly they learned to plant with honesty, to share without greed, to walk in the shadow of their shame and still seek the light. And always, when the fire was lit at festivals, voices told the tale of the maiden who had returned from exile, carrying a secret that burned away lies. Children leaned close to the flames as elders whispered, "Remember Eileen, the daughter of the crescent moon. Cast out by betrayal, she walked the wilderness, returned with truth, and chose freedom over vengeance. She showed us that greed will consume even the proudest heart, and that lies, no matter how cleverly woven, cannot stand against the fire of truth." The moral lived longer than the faces who first spoke it. Mothers taught their children to guard against envy, fathers warned their sons that ambition without honor leads to ruin, and wanderers who passed through the valley carried the story to other lands. And in each retelling, Eileen grew greater, not just a girl betrayed, but a guardian who had carried the fire of truth across the world. And so the folktale endured, that betrayal can tear even the strongest bond, that greed can devour entire clans, but that truth, burning brighter than any flame, can cleanse what lies destroy. Eileen became a name spoken with reverence, not for the crown she might have claimed, but for the freedom she chose instead. In the hush of winter nights, when families gathered around the fire and children's eyes shone wide, her story flickered with the flames, alive as ever, a reminder that legends are not born in comfort but in ash, exile, and the courage to return.